When William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon on St. George's Day 1564, few people could have guessed the impact he would have on the world of literature. He also made an equally dramatic impression on the Warwickshire countryside, so that today, some 400 years later, the entire region around Stratford-upon-Avon is fondly referred to as Shakespeare country. But the great bard of Avon isn't the only man of genius to have influenced the locality. When James Brindley, engineer extraordinaire, realised that it was possible to improve the nation's transport system by building canals to link the major rivers of Britain to the new economic centres of the Industrial Revolution, he set a trend in motion that was to indelibly carve its way across the length and breadth of the land, and the Warwickshire landscape of Shakespeare's birth was certainly no exception. Today, the waterways that run through Shakespeare country are a holiday destination in their own right, with narrowboating proving to be a very popular pastime. This programme has been designed to take you on a narrowboat journey on what is today known as the Avon Ring, featuring the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, the Stratford Canal, and the River Avon. To complete the circuit, you do need to travel some distance on the River Severn, but because this part of the trip takes you out of Shakespeare country for a short while, we'll not actually be showing it. In the previous programme in this series, Waterway Magic, all the basics for getting started on the canals were covered. Locking up, locking down, making headway, mooring up, and travelling through a tunnel. So this time round, we'll be concentrating more specifically on slightly more advanced procedures. However, don't worry if you haven't seen that programme, everything's explained. But for the novice embarking on a first narrowboat adventure, Waterway Magic is well worth taking a look at. At the end of the journey featured in Waterway Magic, we reached the winding hole at Stoke Prior on the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, just before the magnificent Tardybig Flight of Locks, one of the finest challenges to be found today on Britain's inland waterways. So now we're back to show you how it's done. But first, to fully explain the way in which the circular trip actually works, we'll take a quick look at how we got here. This is the Viking Afloat hire base in the centre of the beautiful cathedral city of Worcester, where our craft for the week, Helga, is being picked up. Many people arrive at Worcester by narrowboat from the wide-flowing River Severn, travelling through the city centre on the Worcester-Birmingham Canal, but it's also an ideal spot to start the Avon Ring from. Up into the canal, the residential suburbs of Worcester sprawl out until you reach greener countryside and more attractive landscapes. The Astward Flight of Locks is certainly most picturesque and is a great place to moor up in order to gather your strength before tackling the Tardebigge flight. With a 3-man crew, 1 driving and 2 locking, a flight like this is not as daunting as you might at first think. If you count the 6 neighbouring locks between Stoke Prior and Tardebigge Bottom Lock as well, you need to go through 36 locks to travel a distance of just 4 miles. Getting a good routine going is most helpful, and one of the locking crew remaining with the boat to finish the closing of the gate and the winding down of paddles, while the other goes on ahead to open up the next lock so that the boat driver can motor straight in, is the best technique to aim for. Fortunately, narrowboating is a fairly sociable business, and it's unlikely that you'll be the only boat in the flight. When you meet people coming in the opposite direction, you can leave gates open for them, and vice versa. And of course, working your boats with a straight exchange of water is the quickest way to go. If you're not careful, it's easy to get so obsessed with what you're doing that you miss spotting a boat coming in the opposite direction, which will not only waste water, it'll also probably mean you'll end up working much harder than you actually need to. As you make your way up the steep flight of locks, the view all around grows more spectacular as your vantage point inclines. The steps up to the Tardebigge Reservoir may seem an added chore for tired, locking legs, but a quick glance over the ridge is pleasant enough reward. When work on the Worcester and Birmingham Canal was started in the early 1790s, there were many obstacles to overcome, not least the hill from Tardebigge Wharf to Stoke Prior that the Tardebigge flight covers today. At first, a system of boat lifts was proposed, but the canal company was decidedly unsure about the idea and experimented with just one at the top of the flight. But as this proved unsatisfactory, the locks were built instead, and by 1815 the canal was complete. Also, as the feeder reservoir, today a popular spot with local anglers, lies about 50 feet below the summit level, a steam engine was built to pump the water up the hill. The engine house still stands today at the penultimate lock in the flight, and has been converted into a very pleasant pub, where weary boat crews can enjoy not only a well-earned drink, but good food is on offer as well. However, there's something rather defeatist about stopping short of the end of the flight. The momentum that's driven you so far needs to be satisfied by the much anticipated Tardy Big Top Lock sign coming into view. But perhaps for boat crews setting off in the opposite direction to go down the locks, a drink and a meal to stoke up the energy levels is not such a bad idea. Tardy Big Top Lock is one of the deepest narrow locks in the country, because it was the experimental boat lift that was abandoned so many years ago. Measuring to a depth of 14 feet, the lock gates alone are pretty impressive, and as you wait for it to fill to finally complete the Tardy Big flight, there's plenty of time to reflect on the last few hours' work. It's only now that you can stop for breath, and many narrowboats will moor up for a brief respite. Ironically, this is the exact spot where Tom Rolt and Robert Aikman, the founding fathers of the Inland Waterways Association, met in 1945, bringing that most worthy of enterprises into being. As a direct result of that meeting, modern-day narrowboats are able to relive the pleasures of a waterway age that was fortunately just overlooked rather than lost forever. Tardy Big Church, an elegant 18th century construction, has a delicate spire that really does stand at the summit of the hill, and at this point in time, having successfully got here, it both literally and metaphorically feels like the top of the world. You know as you shut the last lock gate on the Tardy Big flight, you've achieved something memorable, and as you head off into the Tardy Big tunnel, you just know that the next narrowboaters you meet along the way are going to hear all about your exploits in the Tardy Big flight. It'll be a story to tell at the lockside for the rest of the trip. Once clear of Tardy Big, the Worcestershire countryside opens out to reveal one of the most picturesque stretches of this canal. Leafy wooded slopes gently climb towards the Lickey Hills, and although the narrowboater can enjoy the pleasant birdsong, for a short distance at least, the hum of the traffic on the nearby M42 motorway is never far away. The relief of having a good long stretch of canal without a lock in sight is certainly much appreciated. However, there are still a few obstacles for the boat driver to negotiate, as there are plenty of moored boats along this part of the canal, and a reduction in speed is definitely advisable. Many walkers use the towpath through this particularly pleasant area of countryside, although when the weather is wet, this does get very muddy remarkably quickly. After a period of good steady progress, the entrance to King's Norton Tunnel appears before you. The tunnel is also known as Wast or West Hill, but whatever name you choose to give it, nothing alters the fact that at 2,726 yards in length, this is one of the longest canal tunnels in Great Britain. You have to be prepared for a long, cautious drive through the darkness, as it'll take at least half an hour before you reach the other end. When work on this tunnel began in 1794, the experts of the day described it as a stupendous undertaking, a fact borne out by the 13 years it took for the work to be completed. Even when boats could travel through from 1807 onwards, it was no easy task. Like nearly all the tunnels on the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, there's no towpath, which meant that the entire 2,726 yards had to be legged. Legging required a great deal of strength. The boatmen had to lie on their backs on boards that extended out to allow them to reach the walls of the tunnel with their feet, so that they could literally walk the boat through. The steady chug of today's modern engine is extremely comforting when you stop and think how this journey would once have been made. Not only was the work physically demanding, it must also have been very uncomfortable, with cold water dripping onto their faces the whole time. Even on a fairly pleasant day, which today has definitely been, you can see for yourselves the constant drips from the low, damp brickwork. Things did improve for the boatmen after 1870, when steam tugs were employed to pull trains of narrowboats through the tunnel, and the practice was continued until the use of this canal went into decline in the early 1900s. When the light of an oncoming boat in the dark, dim distance comes into view, it can be quite disconcerting, as it's very difficult to judge just how far away it is. So long as everyone slows down and pays attention, the passing of boats shouldn't be a problem, because despite the seeming claustrophobic narrowness of the tunnel, there's in fact more than enough space for two boats to pass each other. As the light at the end of the tunnel starts to appear, there's certainly a feeling of relief, particularly for those who are uncomfortable in a confined space. But just like the sense of achievement you feel at completing the Tardebigge flight, there's a certain degree of satisfaction at exiting the dark tunnel portal blinking in the bright light of day. There's a distinct change in the countryside when you pull out of the tunnel. No longer does the leafy Worcestershire countryside roll down to the canal's edge, because we've now entered the outskirts of Birmingham and the sprawling remnants of the industrial Black Country. The ridge of hills that the King's Norton Tunnel cuts into is a significant geographical boundary, and the next stretch of our journey is one that we'll choose not to linger over. From the point of view of the narrowboating holidaymaker, part of the joy of the canal experience is being able to stop and moor up wherever the fancy takes you. Sadly, in a modern world, urban areas like this, despite the canal's still attractive appearance, are best treated with caution when it comes to overnight moorings or leaving the boat unattended. This brings us to the end of our travels on the Worcester and Birmingham Canal as the junction house at King's Norton appears, and a signpost instructs a right turn to Stratford-upon-Avon. If you continue up the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, you would arrive at Gas Street Basin, at the heart of Birmingham city centre, but we're heading off onto the Stratford Canal, which will eventually take us into the far more green and pleasant landscape of Shakespeare country. The entrance to Stratford Canal is fiercely guarded by the remnants of the King's Norton guillotine stoplock. Today, narrowboats simply pass underneath, with water flowing freely, but in the early days of canal history, rival companies frequently got into heated debates about whose water belonged to whom, and stoplocks of this type were incorporated into canal designs to protect water supplies. The Stratford Canal has had a very checkered history, and before this part of the journey begins, it's well worth stepping back in time to take a look at how this unique waterway came into being. For the industrial Midlands, and Birmingham in particular, the opening of canals, such as the Oxford and the Coventry, was vitally important from 1790 onwards, providing transport routes to London, with the Trent and Mersey Canal offering routes northwards. Proposals were in place for further canals, but for the shrewd business folk of Stratford-upon-Avon, the fact that the closest route would only come within 8 miles of the town was worrying. The thought of new trade routes passing them by was alarming, and blueprints for a Stratford Canal were drawn up and brought before Parliament, resulting in an Act being passed, allowing construction to begin in March 1793. At first, progress was rapid. The Stratford Canal was to start at King's Norton on the Worcester and Birmingham Canal, which at the time was far from completion itself. Unfortunately, the total estimated cost for the canal was spent in the first 3 years, covering a distance of just over 9.5 miles. The next 4 years proved slow going, even the route needed to be revised, but eventually, in 1803, the canal reached its junction with the Warwick and Birmingham Canal, which today is part of the Grand Union Main Line. By this time, it was evident that more money than ever was required, and the canal's private investors were reluctant to pour in more funds. It took until 1812 for cutting to recommence, with another adjustment being made to the route in 1815, to finally take the canal to its present-day junction with the River Avon at Stratford. The prosperity of this canal was sadly very short-lived, because by 1835 the Great Western Railway had taken the majority of the freight trade in the area, and by 1856 the GWR had bought out the canal company completely. Although a very limited amount of traffic still used the route until the 1930s, by this stage it really had fallen into terrible disrepair. Despite the fact that interest in recreational boating was on the increase by 1955, recommendations were then made to close the derelict southern section of the Stratford Canal. Fortunately for narrowboaters the world over, the public outcry was so great that a campaign was set in motion to save the Stratford Canal. For generations of canal enthusiasts, the Stratford certainly holds a very special place in their affections, as this southern section that came so close to complete abandonment was one of the first fully restored inland waterways to return to navigable status in 1964. Today, British Waterways have responsibility for the care and maintenance of the Stratford Canal, which has become a much-loved section of the Avon Ring for the serious narrowboater and holiday maker alike. Once the sprawling housing estates have been left behind, the Stratford Canal opens out in charming and picturesque style. You'll now find yourself surrounded by the Forest of Arden, with the canal engulfed by a mantle of trees. This is far more the type of countryside associated with William Shakespeare. In fact, the Forest of Arden was the idyllic, rustic setting for the fairy frolics of Oberon, Bottom and Titania in his play A Midsummer Night's Dream. As attractive as this part of the canal journey is today, there was a time in the more recent past when this woodland was a lot denser. In the 1970s, the landscape of Shakespeare country, like much of southern Britain, was subjected to the ravages of Dutch elm disease. With a prolific distribution of elms, Warwickshire and the Vale of Evesham suffered terrible losses. With ancient elms making up half of the hedgerow trees in the region, the disease became commonly nicknamed the Warwickshire weed. Fortunately, today, some 30 years on, the view is dappled and leafy once more, but without doubt, at the time when the Forest of Arden inspired Shakespeare to pick up a quill and wax lyrical about the fairy folk, this whole area would have been a much greener, mystical, and altogether more magical place. On this upper section of the Stratford Canal, the bridges are classic brick arches, but as there were few roads of any significance in the area at the time of the canal's construction, they're spaced at infrequent intervals. The view along the canal is little disturbed through this part of the journey, as there are no locks after the Kings Norton stop lock for almost 10 miles. With the steady hum of the boat engine, the peace and quiet combined with the soporific fluttering of green leaves can be very pleasant and relaxing. All the hard work of Tardybig seems to fade in the memory, and aching muscles feel at least a little soothed by the tranquil pace as we're Stratford bound. This is a great stretch of canal to take a well-earned break, as you can moor up in the most delightful of surroundings and leave the water to visit some of the land-based attractions to be found in the heart of Shakespeare country. The canal doesn't have a monopoly on preserved history, as you'll see if you wander into some of the lovely villages that this region is famous for. This old mill is classically beautiful and paints an archetypical view of old England. But unlike so many similar historic buildings, this ancient treasure has not been turned into a highly desirable country residence. Step inside and you really will be transported back in time, with sights, sounds and smells that are quite incredible. This working flour mill has been producing its wares in the same way for centuries, and a look around the dusty machinery will reveal the intricacies of an age-old craft. With the modern-day interest in organic food, the flour from this mill is in great demand. Anyone who comes here will quickly see for themselves that this flour is completely uncontaminated by preservatives, and the food value is significant, as the entire goodness of the wheat remains in the finished product. People will travel miles to buy their flour from this miller, and it's ironic that it's Britain's modern-day multicultural society that truly appreciates the quality of this fine flour. Birmingham has become, without doubt, a paradise for lovers of Indian food, with a fantastic choice of Indian restaurants and balti houses to suit every taste. Word quickly got around that there was a traditional mill in the vicinity, and by all accounts, the fine flowing flour that you've been looking at produces the best chapatis and naan breads you're ever likely to taste. Fortunately for today's narrowboaters, galley kitchens are usually equipped with full-size ovens, so it's well worth taking a bag of this flour back on board for a touch of traditional baking as you continue with your journey. The next feature of note is the Lapworth Flight, which is where the 55 narrow locks down into Stratford begin. The Lapworth Flight doesn't get going in earnest immediately, as the first 4 locks are pleasantly spaced, followed by a half-mile breathing space. However, memories of Tardybig come flooding back when you first view the next 9 locks, which are spaced just a few yards apart. This classic image illustrates perfectly all that is special about narrowboating in the heart of Shakespeare country. It's also a fine tribute to all those people who worked with such dedication to restore the Stratford Canal to its former glory. For narrowboat drivers, these locks with their short intervening pounds can be quite a challenge if other boats are coming in the opposite direction, and here, more than anywhere, a degree of friendly, tolerant cooperation will benefit everyone. It's also noticeable from this point onwards that the style of bridge used to cross the canal has changed. Perhaps one of the best loved features on the Stratford Canal, these old cast iron split bridges are absolutely charming. Built in 2 angled halves, there's a 1-inch gap in the middle of the bridge. It's quite a puzzle when you first see these bridges, and many a modern narrowboater has stopped to ponder the presence of such a feature. Think back to the early days of the canals, and you'll have your answer. The split in the bridge was cleverly designed so that the rope attaching the towing horse need not be disconnected as the obstacle was negotiated, thus saving time and energy. Once the Lapworth Flight of locks has been completed, you'll immediately come to Kingswood Junction, where the Stratford Canal meets the Grand Union. Today, a group of artists have chosen this fascinating location to put their skills to the test, and with such a variety of views all around, the challenge is a most pleasant one. Beyond Kingswood Junction, the Stratford Canal continues southward, locking steadily downward. This part of the journey is truly to be cherished, and as the locks have single gates with small paddles making them slow to fill and empty, you'll have plenty of time to appreciate your surroundings. The barrel-roofed cottages that are as evocative a landmark on this canal as the little split bridges will come into view on this timeless stretch of water. Most are inhabited and well cared for, as are the mown towpaths, well-trimmed hedges, and neatly painted lock gates. The canal passes through very pretty wooded country, and there are few main roads to interrupt the tranquillity of the scene. However many canals you may have travelled, there's little to equal the pleasure of mooring up for the night in such beautiful surroundings. Watching the sun go down after a good day's travel is a particular delight, as especially by this stage of your journey around the Avon Ring, the canals really will have worked their magic, and the hustle, bustle of 21st century life will seem a million miles away. Even if the idea of getting up with the sun might not necessarily seem in keeping with the idea of a relaxing narrowboat holiday, it's well worth doing, if only once, during your trip. The peaceful, misty morning light throws a whole new perspective on the sleepy countryside, and it would be easy to believe that entire centuries of history had never actually happened. But, with the prospect of another day ahead, an early start is most advantageous, because from this point, just north of the busy scattered village of Wootton Wowan, we've every chance of arriving in Stratford-upon-Avon by tea time. Whilst travelling the Stratford Canal, you'll encounter 3 iron aqueducts, the longest of which, the Edstone, or the Bearley as it's sometimes known, measures 200 yards. This dramatic feat of engineering is the Stratford's most complex construction, raised 28 feet above the Warwickshire countryside. The view for the narrowboater is quite unique, particularly as the rest of the world rushes by at full speed beneath you. Not only is there a road and a river tributary, there are also the twin tracks of the Birmingham and North Warwickshire Railway, with Centro's green Sprinter trains carrying passengers to and from Stratford at regular intervals. A short distance beyond Edstone Aqueduct, we come to the village of Wilmcote, where good visitor moorings are on offer. For the narrowboater with an interest in Shakespeare, a stop here is an absolute must, as just a matter of yards from the canal stands Mary Arden's house, the girlhood home of William Shakespeare's mother. This classic black and white timbered farmhouse with traditional cottage gardens is famous the world over as Mary Arden's house, but in point of fact, more recent research suggests that the renowned matron actually lived in this neighbouring cottage. Whatever the case may or may not be, it's well worth paying a visit, as the site today also incorporates the Shakespeare Countryside Museum, which has many prize-winning exhibits painting an evocative picture of rural life in Shakespeare's day. And so to Stratford, the birthplace of William Shakespeare. But there are still 16 locks ahead of us before we reach our destination. Gradually, as Stratford starts to appear over the horizon, it looks very much like any other modern English skyline. For a first view of Stratford, the canal presents a surprisingly unhistoric and unromantic appearance, and it comes as quite a shock, albeit a pleasant one, when after passing under a dark bridge, the boat suddenly pulls out into the daylight of the lovely Stratford Basin. Mooring up alongside Stratford's attractive Bancroft Gardens is a luxury that would never be afforded to the car driver, who has to vie with every other tourist in the town for a parking space. After the unpopulated reaches of the canal and pleasant encounters with fellow narrowboaters, the hectic pace of Stratford, buzzing with visitors, seems incredibly noisy and busy. William Shakespeare himself presides over all of the comings and goings from his vantage point at the top of the Gower Memorial, surrounded by statues of Hamlet, Prince Hal, Falstaff, and Lady Macbeth. These dramatic characters from Shakespeare's plays represent philosophy, history, comedy and tragedy, the major themes of the great man's work. This memorial actually dates back to 1888, but it's only stood in its present position since 1933, when the town's civic dignitaries deemed it a fittingly grand statue to welcome Stratford's visitors. There are many sights to see in Stratford, if you have the time, and of course, according to the flourishing tourist industry, William Shakespeare was historically associated with each and every one of them. However, for the narrowboater, it is perhaps the surprisingly modern-looking Royal Shakespeare Theatre, running adjacent to the canal basin, which makes the most lasting impression. The original theatre, which dated back to 1879, was damaged by fire in 1926, and much of it had to be rebuilt in the style of the day. Fortunately, some of the more classic features did survive, and you do get a more pleasant view of this world-famous theatre from the river. When it comes to leaving Stratford to head off southwards on the River Avon, it takes a cool customer to negotiate the exit lock in perfect style. This is because a narrowboat passing through is guaranteed to draw a crowd, and it can be quite disconcerting to wind paddles, operate lock gates, and steer the boat under the watchful gaze of so many curious tourists. But it's all very good-humoured, with a cosmopolitan mix of nationalities stopping to appreciate the unique spectacle of an English narrowboat set against this most dramatic of historic backdrops. Out on the river, the whole character of narrowboating changes completely. No longer is the driver constrained by the confines of the narrow canal banks, and there are many more varieties of craft happily afloat. Locking is also a very different experience, as the more modern, technologically advanced broad locks on this part of the river offer a different set of challenges. With strong currents and lockside weirs to contend with as well, the narrowboat driver still needs to keep his wits about him. But the change of scenery is certainly refreshing, and the Avon is without doubt one of the most picturesque rivers in Britain. Unfortunately, the happy-go-lucky, more-up-where-you-please attitude that you can enjoy at the canal side doesn't always apply along the riverbank, with many property owners laying vociferous claim to specific stretches of water. Private, no mooring signs are sadly an all-too-frequent sight on the River Avon. Nevertheless, this classic mooring is just a short distance from Stratford's town centre, where the peace and tranquillity of the countryside once again reign supreme, proving that it is possible to find fabulous moorings if you know where to look. After the artificial stillness of the canal, the crashing water of the weir makes a fascinating view, and in the misty morning it undoubtedly makes for an exhilarating start to this, our last day narrowboating in the heart of Shakespeare country. Today our journey down the River Avon is classically peaceful, with little to disturb the charm and rural ambience. However, as this was one of the first rivers in Britain to be made navigable in the 1630s, it wasn't always quite so peaceful. Able to carry 30-ton vessels, the river transported the rich agricultural produce of Warwickshire to the major port of Bristol, and it was anything but one-way traffic. Much prized exotic imports such as sugar, spices and tobacco were sent northwards up the river to the homes of rich and prosperous Midlanders. Watching the world go by on either side of you as you pass through countryside that would have been familiar to Shakespeare, the attractive ancient town of Bidford-on-Avon is announced as imminent by the classically elegant 15th century bridge. Although there are plenty of arches, only one is navigable, so you do have to follow the signs, and during the busy summer season it can be quite interesting to watch narrowboaters of various degrees of proficiency negotiate this one. Local landlords claim that Bidford was a favourite drinking haunt of William Shakespeare in his younger days, and with excellent facilities on offer for the more modern connoisseur of fine ale, it's still a very popular spot for a little light refreshment. The river itself, however, is probably the biggest attraction, with beautifully landscaped waterside recreation grounds, and this once quite small village has developed into a veritable bustling resort town for the region. The houses the narrowboater will pass on this stretch of the river are absolutely stunning, with some equally stunning price tags to match. Looking at the river, as it gently flows onwards towards Evesham, it's hard to imagine it in different circumstances, but the narrowboating holidaymaker needs to be aware of the river warning system that British Waterways has in operation on the Avon. Even at the height of summer, a sudden downpour can put this river into flood, which will result in its closure until water levels return to normal. All the narrowboater can do is moor up and wait, a situation that doesn't arise in the canal system, where water levels are pretty much constant whatever the weather. After seeing the fascinating working flour mill earlier in this programme, it's quite a contrast to take a closer look at the derelict ruins of Harvington Mill, which has been disused since the early 1900s. The mill stands next to the Robert Aikman Memorial Lock, which ironically is both the oldest and the newest lock on the restored Upper Avon. First constructed in 1969, the original location suffered terrible erosion and consequently unworkable siltation, which resulted in the lock's eventual relocation to this present-day site in 1982. As this narrowboat journey draws to a close, with Evesham, our programme's final destination, stretching out into the distance, we firstly need to pass through Evesham Lock. This is the only manned lock you'll encounter on the Avon in Shakespeare country, so you do need to time your arrival to avoid lunch breaks and closing times. The lockkeeper's house is an amazing 1970s triangular construction built across the chamber of an earlier lock, and it's a far cry from the more usual 19th century lockkeepers' cottages we've seen along the way. As peaceful English market towns go, Evesham is without doubt a lovely example, and it's difficult to imagine that one of the bloodiest massacres in the nation's history took place here, within the meandering bends of the Avon. The 1265 Battle of Evesham was fought quite literally to the death on the peninsula formed by the course of the river. King Henry III was not a popular monarch, and his barons, led by Simon de Montfort, forced his royal majesty to allow them to form the first English Parliament. True to his untrustworthy reputation, the king reneged on the deal, and after the ensuing civil unrest, de Montfort and his men were driven onto the Evesham Peninsula, where the king's men, led by his son, Prince Edward, cut off the rebel forces and massacred every last man standing. Interestingly, this was a battle that we know Shakespeare was aware of, because he actually makes reference to it in his play King Henry VI. Evesham slips by with a peaceful grace, and the River Avon continues ever seaward towards Pershore and Tewkesbury. From Tewkesbury, the Avon Ring will take us out onto the River Severn with an estimated travel time of 5 hours to return to the Viking Afloat boatyard in Worcester. But for narrowboating through the heart of Shakespeare country, Evesham is where most would agree that the great bard of Avon's influence begins to wane. Returning to the real world, after what's undoubtedly been a real taste of bygone age, will seem very strange, particularly as the distances that we've taken a week to cover by narrowboat will be covered in minutes by road on the journey home. But the memories, forged travelling the Avon Ring through the heart of Shakespeare's country, will never be forgotten, and it won't be too long before the appeal of Britain's inland waterways will set you planning your next narrowboat adventure.